I was standing in my kitchen when my husband walked in with that look. The one that said he'd finally found the proof. 20 years of perfect lies, and it took him less than 5 minutes to destroy every single one of them. My name is Sarah, and for 2 decades I built what everyone called the perfect American life. We lived in a craftsman house in Portland's Hawthorne district, the kind with hydrangeas in the front yard and a swing on the porch. My husband David taught history at Lincoln High School. Our daughter Emma was finishing her sophomore year at Reed College. On paper, we were untouchable. But paper burns fast when you light the right match. The thing about secrets is they don't stay buried. They grow roots. And mine had been growing for 20 years, wrapping around everything I touched, strangling the truth until even I forgot where the lie ended and my real life began. It started the summer before David and I got married. I was 24, working at a bookstore in Seattle's Capitol Hill, and I met someone. His name was Marcus. He had dark eyes that seemed to see through every wall I'd ever built, and a smile that made me forget I was engaged to a good man who loved me. What happened between us lasted exactly 6 weeks. 6 weeks that would define the next 2 decades of my life. When I found out I was pregnant, Marcus was already gone, transferred to his company's office in Chicago. No forwarding number, no social media trail. This was 2005. People could still disappear if they wanted to. And I made a choice that seemed simple at the time. I never told David the baby might not be his. If you're still watching, leave a comment telling me if you'd have done the same thing. Because what came next makes that first lie look like mercy. Emma was born with David's last name and my dark hair. She had brown eyes like mine, a smile that could have belonged to either man, and absolutely nothing that screamed, "This child isn't yours." David fell in love with her instantly. He was the kind of father who woke up for 3 a.m. feedings, who learned to braid hair from YouTube videos, who never missed a single soccer game. Watching him with her was the most beautiful torture I'd ever experienced. Every birthday felt like theft. Every Father's Day card Emma made with her small hands was another brick in the wall of my deception. But I told myself I was protecting them both. David got to be a father. Emma got to grow up with a dad who adored her. And me? I got to live with the weight of knowing I'd stolen that choice from everyone involved. The years passed. Emma grew into a smart, stubborn teenager with my sarcasm and what I convinced myself was David's sense of justice. We moved from Seattle to Portland when she was 7. David got his teaching position. I started working as a freelance graphic designer from home. We had dinner together every night. We took vacations to Cannon Beach every summer. We were happy, but I wasn't. Because every time Emma got sick, every time she needed medical records, every time a school form asked about family history, I had to lie or deflect or pray no one looked too closely. The fear became background noise, always humming, never quite loud enough to drown out life, but never quiet enough to forget. Then Emma turned 19 and decided she wanted to do one of those DNA ancestry tests. When she mentioned it at dinner one night, my fork froze halfway to my mouth. David thought it was a great idea. His grandmother had immigrated from Ireland, and he was curious about the percentages. Emma was laughing about wanting to know if she had any Viking blood. And I was calculating how fast I could make this problem disappear. I tried everything. I told her those tests weren't accurate. I said they sold your data. I even tried to convince her it was a waste of money. But Emma had always been stubborn, and the more I pushed against it, the more determined she became. Finally, David asked me why I cared so much, and I had to back down before my panic gave me away. She ordered the test in September. For 8 weeks, I barely slept. I snapped at David over nothing. I forgot client deadlines. I started having panic attacks in the grocery store, in traffic, in the middle of the night. David thought it was perimenopause. Emma thought I was stressed about work. The truth was, I was watching my entire life count down to an explosion I couldn't stop. The results came back in November, right before Thanksgiving. If you think you know where this is going, keep watching. Because what happened next was so much worse than I could have imagined. Emma didn't say anything at first. She opened the email at breakfast, went quiet, stared at her phone for what felt like an hour, but was probably 90 seconds, then excused herself and went to her room. David asked if she was okay. I said she was probably just surprised by the results. My voice sounded normal. My hands were shaking so hard I had to sit on them. 3 hours later, Emma came downstairs and asked to talk to me alone. We sat in the living room, her on the couch, me in the chair by the window, the November rain hammering against the glass. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She just looked at me with these eyes that were suddenly a stranger's and asked me if there was anything I needed to tell her about her father. My first instinct was to lie. I'd gotten so good at it. But something in her face stopped me. Maybe it was the fact that she'd phrased it as a courtesy, like she was giving me one last chance to tell the truth before she stopped believing anything I said ever again. So I told her. Not everything. Not at first. Just that there had been someone else before David and I got married, and that the timing had been complicated, and that I'd never been completely certain, but I'd made a choice to move forward anyway. I made it sound like an accident of timing rather than a deliberate deception. I made it sound forgivable. Emma listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked me one question. Does Dad know? And I said no. She stood up, told me I had until Christmas to tell him myself, and walked out of the room. That night, she drove back to campus 3 weeks early, and she didn't answer my calls for 2 days. Subscribe now if you want to see how much worse this gets, because I haven't even reached the part that destroyed everything. I had 6 weeks to figure out how to tell my husband that our daughter might not be his, that I'd lied for 20 years, that every moment of our family life had been built on a foundation I knew was cracked. 6 weeks to find words that would make this survivable. But every time I tried to start the conversation, my throat closed up. How do you tell someone you've stolen 2 decades from them? How do you hand someone that kind of pain and expect them to still love you? So I did what I'd always done. I waited. I hoped. I told myself maybe Emma would change her mind. Maybe she'd see how much it would hurt David. Maybe she'd realize some truths aren't worth telling. But Emma had always been more like David than like me. She believed in honesty even when it hurt. Christmas morning arrived. Emma came home on Christmas Eve but barely spoke to me. She was polite to David, helped make cookies, wrapped presents, acted like everything was normal. But I could see it in her eyes every time she looked at me. A countdown. I had hours left, maybe minutes, before she took the choice away from me completely. We opened presents in the living room like we did every year. David gave Emma a first edition of her favorite novel. She gave him a framed photo of the two of them from when she was 5, both of them laughing, covered in sand from a beach trip. He cried a little, which he always did when he was happy. And I sat there knowing I was about to take that happiness and light it on fire. After presents, while David was in the kitchen starting breakfast, Emma looked at me and mouthed the word, now. So I asked David if we could talk outside. We stood on the back porch in the cold. I could see our breath. I could hear carolers somewhere down the street. And I told my husband of 20 years that the daughter he'd raised might not be biologically his. He didn't react at first. He just stared at me like I was speaking a language he'd never heard before. Then he asked me how long I'd known. And I told him I'd suspected from the beginning but never confirmed it, never wanted to know for sure, never thought it mattered because he was her father in every way that counted. He asked if Emma knew. I said yes. He asked how long she'd known. I said 6 weeks. That's when something in his face broke. Not because of the biology, though that clearly hurt him, but because I'd told our daughter before I told him. Because Emma had been carrying this for 6 weeks while he'd been living in ignorance. Because I'd given her the burden of my secret and left her to decide whether to keep lying to the man who'd raised her. David went inside without another word. I heard him talk to Emma in the living room, his voice too quiet for me to make out words. Then I heard the front door close and his car started in the driveway. He didn't come home that night. Emma wouldn't look at me. She packed a bag and left an hour later, said she was staying with a friend, and I was alone in our house on Christmas, surrounded by torn wrapping paper and half-eaten cookies, and the complete destruction of everything I'd spent 20 years building. If you're wondering whether it gets better, stay with me, because I'm about to tell you the part that made everything so much worse I almost didn't survive it. David stayed at his brother's house in Eugene for 3 days. When he came back, he was calm in a way that terrified me more than anger would have. He told me he'd thought about everything, and he'd decided he wanted a paternity test. Not because he didn't love Emma, he made that very clear, but because he needed to know the truth if we were going to figure out how to move forward. I agreed. What else could I do? We told Emma together, over FaceTime because she still wouldn't come home. She said okay in this flat voice that didn't sound like her at all, and we scheduled the test for the week after New Year's. Those 2 weeks were the longest of my life. David slept in the guest room. He was polite, distant, like I was a stranger he was sharing space with temporarily. Emma called him every day but barely texted me. I spent most of my time alone, working on projects I couldn't focus on, crying in the shower, Googling things like how to save your marriage after lying, and finding nothing that applied to a deception this big. The test results came back on January 15th. David opened the email at the kitchen table. I watched his face as he read, trying to decode every micro-expression. He was quiet for a long time. Then he closed his laptop, looked at me, and said 3 words that changed everything. She's not mine. I'm going to be honest with you. I thought I'd prepared myself for this. I thought I knew how it would feel. But hearing it confirmed, seeing the pain in David's eyes, watching 20 years of fatherhood get redefined in a single sentence, nothing could have prepared me for that. He didn't yell. He didn't throw anything. He just asked me if I knew how to find Marcus, and I said I didn't know. He'd disappeared 20 years ago. I wouldn't even know where to start. David said he'd find him anyway, because Emma deserved to know who her biological father was, even if David would always be her real father. And I realized he was doing what he'd always done, putting Emma first, even in the middle of his own devastation. That's when I understood how much I'd underestimated the damage. This wasn't just about David's pain or my guilt. This was about Emma losing the certainty of who she was. This was about a man who'd loved her unconditionally suddenly being redefined as not her real father in the eyes of genetics, even though nothing about their relationship had actually changed. But everything had changed. Comment below if you think I should have left the past buried. Because what I'm about to tell you makes that question so much more complicated. David hired a private investigator. It took 3 weeks, but they found Marcus, married, living in Denver, with 2 teenage sons and a job in corporate finance. The investigator reached out on David's behalf, explained the situation, and asked if Marcus would be willing to talk. Marcus said yes. I don't know what I expected. For him to refuse contact, maybe, or to be angry that I'd never told him, or to not remember me at all after 20 years. But according to David, Marcus was shocked and wanted to meet Emma as soon as possible. That's when Emma asked if she could talk to me. We met at a coffee shop near campus because she didn't want to come home. She looked tired, darker circles under her eyes than I'd ever seen, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing David's old Reed sweatshirt like armor. She ordered a latte she barely touched, and we sat by the window watching students walk by in the February rain. She asked me why I never told her. Not in an accusatory way, just genuine confusion, like she was trying to understand how a mother keeps a secret like this from her child for 2 decades. I told her the truth. I was scared. Scared of losing David, scared of losing her, scared of the mess the truth would make. I told her I'd convinced myself it didn't matter. That David being her father in every meaningful way meant biology was just a technicality. Emma listened to everything. And then she said something that broke me. You took away my chance to know him. You decided for me that I didn't need to know where half of me came from. And you gave me a dad I love so much it kills me to know he's not actually mine, even though he'll always be my dad. She was crying by the end of it. So was I. And I realized there was no version of this story where I was the hero. No angle where my choices protected anyone. No way to reframe 20 years of deception into something noble. I asked her if she was going to meet Marcus, and she said yes. She asked if I wanted to be there, and I said only if she wanted me there. She said she didn't know yet. 3 weeks later, Emma flew to Denver with David. Not with me, with David. The man who wasn't her biological father, but who dropped everything to support her through meeting the man who was. While I stayed home in Portland and waited for updates that came in short, sparse texts with no emotional detail. They met at Marcus's house. His wife knew the whole story and had agreed to the meeting. Emma spent 5 hours there talking to Marcus, meeting her half-brothers, seeing photos of his family that showed her own features reflected back at her from strangers. When she came home, she seemed different, quieter, more settled in some ways, more confused in others. She told me Marcus seemed like a good person, that his sons were nice, that his wife had been surprisingly kind. She told me he'd cried when he saw her, said he wished he'd known, said he would have been there if he'd had the chance. And then she asked me the question I'd been dreading. Did you ever think about telling him? Even once? I wanted to lie, but I'd done enough of that. So I told her the truth. Yes, I'd thought about it, especially in the beginning, but every day that passed made it harder. And eventually I convinced myself that the longer I waited, the more damage the truth would do, so the best thing was to never tell anyone at all. Emma nodded like she'd expected that answer. Then she said, I need some space from you. Not forever, just for now. She moved in with David's brother in Eugene for the spring semester. She talked to David every few days, texted her friends, stayed in touch with Marcus. But she barely contacted me. And when she did, it was purely logistical. Questions about insurance, her tax documents, whether I'd seen her winter coat. And David stayed in the guest room. If you think this is the end of the story, keep watching. Because I haven't told you about the letter yet. It arrived in April, addressed to me in handwriting I didn't recognize. No return address. Portland postmark. Inside was a single page, handwritten from Marcus. He'd written to thank me for raising Emma, to tell me she was extraordinary, to say he understood why I'd made the choices I'd made even if he didn't agree with them. He said he didn't want to cause more problems in my life, but he wanted me to know he was grateful Emma existed, and he was going to be part of her life going forward in whatever capacity she wanted. The letter was kind, generous even, and it made me feel worse than any anger could have. Because Marcus, who I'd erased, who I'd turned into a ghost for 20 years, who I'd stolen fatherhood from before he even knew it existed, was showing me more grace than I'd shown anyone in 2 decades. I showed the letter to David that night. We were in the kitchen, the same place where this whole thing had started unraveling. He read it twice, then handed it back to me and said, he's a better person than I'd be in his position. I asked him if he'd ever be able to forgive me. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I don't know if forgiveness is the right word. I love Emma. She's my daughter, biology or not. Nothing changes that. But every time I look at you now, I see 20 years of lies. I see every moment you chose to protect yourself instead of trusting me. And I don't know how to unsee that. He filed for separation 2 weeks later. Not divorce, not yet. Just legal separation, space to figure out what came next. He moved into an apartment in Northwest Portland, walking distance from his school. Emma started splitting time between his place and Eugene, still avoiding home. And I was alone in the house we'd filled with 20 years of memories that now felt like evidence of my crimes. I know what you're thinking, that I deserve this, that this is justice, that I brought all of this on myself. And you're right, I did. But the thing about consequences is they don't just punish you, they radiate outward, hitting everyone in the blast radius. Emma's relationship with David became complicated, not less loving, but layered with this new awareness that he'd chosen to be her father, even after finding out he wasn't biologically obligated to. Marcus became a fixture in her life, a new relationship she was building from scratch. And I became the villain in a story where I'd only ever tried to protect the people I loved, even if my methods were unforgivable. Subscribe if you're still with me, because there's one more thing I haven't told you yet, and it's the reason I'm finally sharing this story. Last month, Emma asked to meet with me, David and Marcus all together. She said she needed to say something to all of us at once, and she didn't want to have to repeat it. We met at a neutral location, a conference room at a community center in Southeast Portland. Emma sat at the head of the table with the 3 of us arranged around her like some kind of twisted family tribunal. She told us she'd been in therapy since January, working through everything that had happened. She said she'd finally reached a point where she understood that she could love David as her father and want to know Marcus as her biological parent without those things being in conflict. She said she was grateful to Marcus for being open to a relationship and grateful to David for loving her regardless of DNA. Then she looked at me and said, and I'm grateful to you for giving me life, even if I'm still angry about the lies. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't absolution, but it was acknowledgement that I was still her mother, even if I'd failed her in fundamental ways. She told us she wanted us to figure out how to coexist in her life, that she wasn't going to choose between us, wasn't going to cut anyone out, wasn't going to pretend the situation wasn't complicated. She said we all had to do the work to make this functional, because she was done carrying the weight of everyone else's pain. And then she left, and the three of us sat there in silence, strangers bound together by a 20-year-old lie and the young woman it had created. I still don't know if David will ever come home. I don't know if Emma will ever fully trust me again. I don't know what kind of relationship I'll have with Marcus, or if we'll just remain distant planets in Emma's orbit, never quite touching but forever linked. What I do know is that the truth, no matter how ugly, no matter how destructive, was always going to come out eventually. And the longer I waited, the more people I hurt when it finally did. So now I'm here, telling this to you, because I need you to understand something. Secrets don't protect the people you love. They just delay the pain while making it grow larger in the darkness. And by the time the light finally hits, the damage is so much worse than it ever had to be. If you've watched this far, leave a comment telling me what you would have done differently, because I replay those 20 years constantly, looking for the moment I could have changed course, and I still don't know if I'd have had the courage to tell the truth, even if I'd known how this would end. My name is Sarah. I lived 20 years of my life inside a lie, and now I'm living with what's left after the truth burned everything down. Thanks for staying with me through this. Hit subscribe if you want to hear what happens next, because this story isn't over. David has started talking about couples therapy. Emma invited me to dinner next week, and Marcus sent me another letter I haven't opened yet. The wreckage is still smoking, but maybe somewhere in the ashes, there's a chance to build something real. Or maybe some things, once broken, stay that way forever.